Well, hello everybody. Thumbs up on the sound and everything, Lindsay? All right. Hey, I want to thank Tom Anderson of the Trails Club for putting together that slideshow. The history of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club is just amazing, and I appreciate Tom's effort on all of that. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Doug Mcclelland. I'm the president of the Mountain to Sound Greenway Trust. Many of you probably know me. I worked 40 years for the Department of Natural Resources. And behind me is my good friend, Harvey Manning. This is the Harvey Manning statue, campfire next to me here. And just wanted to try to get people introduced to what's going to go on tonight. So I'm glad you could make it. A little bit of the logistics. If you're on your computer, if you look in the upper right-hand corner, there's a button you can push on and you have layout options. And I'd recommend you put it on stage view. If you happen to be on your phone, there's some buttons in the upper right-hand corner, and focus view is what you want. And then tonight, when Sally Jewell is on, there'll be an opportunity for asking questions of her. So use the chat function for that and make your comments or questions to all panelists. So we'll try to get as many of those questions from the audience as we can. So that's kind of some of the logistics for what's going on. You know, before we start, I wanted to acknowledge that we're connected from the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish people who've stewarded these lands from time since immortal. We know we have a lot to learn, and it's our intention to respect, engage, and collaborate with tribal governments in our work to preserve and protect native lands. You know, when you are out this next year and you're at Lake Sammamish, think of the kokanee salmon and how important that is to the tribes. When you're walking around and you're seeing the first plants come up and you see the salmonberry or the huckleberry, understand how important that is. And when you're on Tradition Plateau or anywhere else and you see a big, majestic cedar tree, understand the value of cedar trees and that whole life-giving tree to our tribes. When you're in the Snoqualmie Valley and you're at Meadowbrook or Tollgate, think of the camas fields that were grown there. But my challenge to everyone here is learn, know, and get to understand the tribes, the Coast Salish people that lived here for thousands of years, live here now, and will be here for thousands of years in the future. Very important. So I wanted to just kind of kick things off tonight. Sally Jewell's who you really want to hear, not Doug, but that's okay. I just wanted to kick it off by having people understand that people like Harvey Manning, the founder of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club, fundamentally changed what we have here as a legacy. He wrote these books, the Footsore guidebooks and the 100 Hikes books that he put together to get people to go out on the landscape. But it was never about the trail. It was about the conservation. And that's what the Issaquah Alps Trails Club is about. And that's where the Issaquah Alps Trails Club had that march in 1990 that my wife Christy and I and our son Jacob were on. And we've been on every march since. That's what created the Mountains to Sound Greenway. And the founder of the Mountain to Sound Greenway is Jim Ellis. I'm sure you're going to hear about him. But I also, and Sally will talk about what a great role he played. But the Trails Club, had they not taken that risk in the 90s to kick off this effort, we wouldn't be with the lands that we have, both in the Issaquah Alps and the entire Mountains to Sound Greenway. And it's amazing. I'd also like you to think about when you hike Margaret's Way on Cougar Mountain. Who's Margaret McLeod and what did she do for the community that was here? Or you're on the Tiger Mountain Trail and you think, who built this trail and who put up these beautiful signs, the little TMT signs? That's Bill Longwell, another foundational person. Chad Thompson, who helped start the Greenway, also was the treasurer for the Greenway and secretary and worked for the Greenway at the very beginning. And came from the Trails Club. So the interweaving of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and the Mountain to Sound Greenway in this community is really important. So I gave you a couple of questions. I want you to learn and know and understand the tribes that are a part of our community, have been here for thousands of years and will be here for thousands of years in the future. Get to know the history of the people involved that are here. Listen to what you gather from Sally tonight and other speakers. and then get to know the land. It's not just the trail, it's the conservation that's important. And if we can all do that, we can leave this place a little bit better for the next generation that's here. I'd like to do a little PowerPoint, just kind of talk to you about the Mountain to Sound Greenway a little bit, the National Heritage Area. So the Mountain to Sound Greenway, just so you know, is 1.5 million acres. It's watershed basins, goes all the way from between Seattle and Ellensburg along I-90, but it's all of the Yakima River Basin from Ellensburg all the way up to Snoqualmie Pass, and it's the Cedar and Snoqualmie River Basins in King County. So it encompasses the fastest growing metro area in the nation, small towns, working farms, forest, rivers, alpine wilderness, and it's a balance. It's a place where we can enjoy clean air, clean water, habitat, recreation, growing and thriving communities, balanced with nature and conservation. And it's unique in our country where you can hike, bike, float, picnic, and experience nature right by. So one of the things that the Greenway worked on was National Heritage Area designation. It was designated by Congress as a place where historic, cultural, and natural resources combined to form a cohesive, national important landscape in 2019. It's a really big deal. Our senators worked really hard for this, as did so many people over 12 years to finally get a heritage area designation. Right now, we're in the middle of planning for it. Get involved in that if you can. The designation offers opportunities to effectively conserve natural resources, preserve and share cultural heritage, and contribute to the economic vitality of our region. Let me tell you about the Mountain to Sound Greenway Trust. The part that I get the privilege and honor of having worked with from the beginning of my 1990 to today, and for another year and a half or so, get to help lead a board of 60 people. So in 1990, the march from Snoqualmie Pass to Puget Sound, led by the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and local citizens, raised awareness of this landscape to protect it from uncontrolled urban sprawl. The club went into debt putting off that march, but they got Gary Locke and Brian Boyle and county executives involved in the Greenway, and it was amazing. And in 1991, the Mountain to Sound Greenway Trust was formed with civic leader Jim Ellis at the helm. If you know Jim Ellis, you should learn about him. We're talking about an individual that helped create the farmland preservation for the King County, the creation of Metro, the cleaning up of Puget Sound, the convention center, and the forward thrust bond issues. And at the ripe age of 70, which means I've got 5 more years, he took on being the president of the Mountain to Sound Greenway Trust. So if you think you can't keep adding, he did that for 10 years to age 80. The challenges of the Greenway is population growth, that demand for outdoor recreation, climate change, and wildfire. And those are big deals right now. We've overloaded those trails. That map there for the hike is really true when you look at places, and we need to think about how much can the landscape handle. But the values of the trust are to have trust between individual, have cooperation upon public and private sectors, and have action to conserve and enhance this landscape. So what's the Greenway do to do that? They convene a broad, diverse coalition of land managers. Maybe next slide. Government agencies, business, conservationists, recreationists, and heritage interest groups. You get involved in land acquisition, place appropriate parcels into public ownership or conservation easements to connect the forest land and habitat. Over 200,000 acres of conservation has occurred since 1990. And working on recreational and regional trail connections for sustainable recreational access to connect trails and encourage active transportation, reduce carbon emissions, enhance public health. And the really neat part of it, and this is how you can get involved both at the Trailhead Trails Club and for the Mountain to Sound Greenway, is learn to become a steward, get involved in habitat restoration, work at the nursery at Lake Sammamish, plant some trees, get your children into outdoor education. So where does the Greenway work? Where do they get involved? The Greenway connects it all, and they have kind of 5 focus areas. The Upper Yakima Basin, which was added in the last 15 years, is basin of forest, farms, and grasslands, and the Teanaway Community Forest, 50,000 acres added to public ownership, the largest acquisition since the Capitol Forest. There's urban parks and trails with volunteer stewards and caretakers. There's the Snoqualmie Valley with its spectacular scenery and world-class recreation and special places that are there. And then there's the Middle Fork, spectacular scenery with world-class recreation and accessible trails to a wild and scenic river and connections to the Alpine Lakes wilderness. Those are just a few of the features that are there that are important to the Mountain to Sound Greenway. And I challenge you to get out and learn, go to the websites of the two organizations, understand how you can get involved and be a player here and take care of an amazing legacy that has been stewarded for thousands of years by our Coast Salish people. And it's now all of our responsibility to hand in hand work in that stewardship for now and future generations. And if we don't teach our kids about this, then we've made a real loss of opportunity. So that's it. You've seen enough of Doug and Harvey and the campfire. I'd really like to introduce somebody who's amazing, and that's Mayor Mary Lou Paulie from the city of Issaquah. Mary Lou is just an incredible individual who has taken on conservation, recreation, and trying to keep Issaquah one of the most amazing livable communities in our area. And I'd like to turn this over to the mayor, and I'll be watching Sally just like you. That's it. Take care here from Harvey's statue. I'm going to go get some marshmallows and make some s'mores.
Well, Doug, thank you for that very wonderful introduction. I'm going to get my video on here. Awesome. Wish I was able to be outside in front of a fire, or maybe in front of Lindsay's fire. I'm just really thrilled to be here tonight and support this event, and it's focused on education and engaging our community about the importance of preserving natural resources and protecting our public lands. The city of Issaquah has a very special relationship with the Issaquah Alps Trails Club. You can see it in the city's new strategic plan, where so many of our initiatives align perfectly with what the Alps Trails Club is trying to do, especially in the area of environmental stewardship. I also just want to do a quick shout out to the city staff that's here tonight. Thank you for hosting us on this technology platform. Even though we couldn't get the sound, the slideshow was absolutely amazing. Thank you for that, Lindsay. And I just wanted to say that when my family came here in 1993, we were not aware of all the history that had gone into preservation of land and creation of trails, but we sure did benefit. One of the first things we did was start to buy those Harvey Manning hiking books and look for the ones for kids. The kids were 4 and 7, and that's how we got to explore the Northwest. I also had no idea that the Mountains of Sound Greenway was so young, that really it had occurred, just basically right before I got here. The amount of work done in the last 25 or so years has been phenomenal. So grateful for everything that's happened. I get to have the great pleasure of introducing Ken Koenigsmark, who is the past president of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club. Ken is retired from Boeing, but most notably, 10 years of his Boeing career were served as a full-time loaned executive to the Mountains of Sound Greenway Board, where he led efforts in land conservation, trail connections, and many other initiatives that comprise the hugely successful Greenway effort. Thank you, Ken, for joining us tonight.
Well, it's my pleasure. I hope everybody can hear me. Lindsay, am I good? Okay. First, thank you, Mary Lou. And I also want to echo what Doug said, that we're so fortunate to have Mary Lou as the mayor of Issaquah now, where her outlook, her actions, and her attitude in prioritizing conservation and the environment are completely in line with what Issaquah Alps missions and goals are as well. I'm very proud to say, too, we have the strongest relationship we've ever had with the city at this point. I'm going to give you a short story of about 30 years ago, where one of the city council members, Wayne Hopman, when I testified at some point, told me flat out, if the Issaquah Alps Trails Club ever said anything nice about the city, I'll frame it and put it on my wall. And it just so happened that about a month or two later, the city made an enormous and historic decision to put 400 plus acres that the city owns up on the Tradition Plateau of Tiger Mountain. If you don't know that, that's owned by the city. And it could have been developed as was being considered. It could have been turned into a golf course as had been proposed, but the city chose to turn it into a conservation area.
Ken?
So I went, Yes.
Ken, this is Tisha. Can you turn your video on for us so we can all
Oh,
see you?
sorry.
Thank you.
There we go. Sorry to ruin everybody's evening with my presence, but anyway, the city made this historic decision to dedicate that 400 acres to conservation. And of course, I went to testify before the council the night of that vote. I said all kinds of good things about the city, and I presented Wayne Hopman with a framed copy of my remarks that I hope he put on his wall. And since that day, the city and the club have had a perfect, good partnership relationship that has helped to further grow the Issaquah Alps and the Mountains to Sound Greenway. So I want to give a couple reminders here before we go into the question and answer session with Sally. And that again is that if you have a question, please go into the chat function in the lower right of the screen, but also check all panelists for who you're sending the chat to, because obviously Sally will not be monitoring if you send to her. We will have other people monitor and provide questions. So please do that. And again, let me just tell you, I'm Ken Koenigsmark. I've been with the club for about 30 years as president, board member, vice president of advocacy. And I moved here in 1984 when Issaquah was truly a one-stop light town. At Front Street and Sunset was the only light in town. I can say that I'm extremely proud to have been part of this organization, this grassroots organization that has preserved over, get this, 25,000 acres of public lands that surround Issaquah, that define Issaquah, and that provide the quality of life and the recreational, environmental, and habitat benefits that are so important to all of us. Issaquah truly would not be the same place were it not for what Harvey Manning, Dave Kapler, and the early members of the club started in the formation of Cougar Mountain Park and what came after. So I think we want to show Lindsay again just quickly. And I will say that we're very lucky to have Lindsay as our executive director for, I believe, going on 3 years now. And our club had always prided ourselves on being lean, mean, and broke. And Lindsay came in with the skills she has and very much professionalized us, got us more organized, and we're still lean and mean, but we're also not broke. So Lindsay's done a great job, and Lindsay will be the one to receive and present questions from the audience. So with that, I'd like to introduce Sally. And I go back with Sally actually to the days when Boeing loaned me out to the Mountains to Sound Greenway, which started in 1993 and lasted until 2003. Sally was on the board at that time, and I was considered a staff person. We were both, at that time, young, strapping baby boomers. For many of you, you could all say, okay, boomer to us now. But we were also boomers that had a purpose to make the world a better place and to leave it a better place. And we, along with all of the other people involved in these conservation efforts, dedicated a lot of effort to doing that. So Sally has a deep passion for outdoor recreation, for conservation, and careful stewardship of the lands that we protect and preserve. I do hope you saw her bio and the event information that was sent out to see that her passion did lead to an extraordinary record of service and accomplishments. And I emphasize the word service because there is a lot of effort and a lot of sacrifice involved in trying to do this public good work. So what wasn't in Sally's bio was any mention of her serving as the Greenway board president for, I believe, 3 years. And she succeeded our legendary founder, Jim Ellis, and had big shoes to fill, which she ably did. She did that get this, while also serving as CEO of REI at the time, as a regent for the University of Washington, and while trying to be a good mother and wife in her family. I shouldn't say trying, she was a good mother and wife within her family. And then we all know, as we know, her accomplishments led to President Obama choosing Sally as his Secretary of the Interior, where she served from 2013 to 2017. And I've personally experienced and value Sally's expertise, her dedication, and her hugely impactful public service. As she mentioned in one of the planning sessions for this forum, lives have been changed by this landscape. Lives have been changed by this landscape. Mine has, I hope many of yours has, and let's keep it that way for the future. So for now though, let's welcome Sally. Sally, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Ken, thank you. And it's so great to be with this wonderful audience, lots of friends I could see in the participant block, and certainly everyone being an advocate for this amazing place that we call home. So thanks for welcoming me, Ken, to the Issaquah Alps Trails Club. And as I reflect on my journey, there's probably nothing that prepared me better to be Secretary of the Interior than my work in these landscapes on the Mount Sound Greenway. So lots of people to appreciate and thank along that way. And Harvey and Jack Horning were on the board with me in those early days. I really got the sense of what a curmudgeon was. Helping Harvey. But also what citizen activism was about. Jim Ellis, of course, an extraordinary mentor and friend. And, you know, he lived to 98 and he was working so hard to document so much of what happened along his life on that journey right up to the very end. And Doug Mcclelland, yes, we were all babies at the same time. And Doug was working in the Department of Natural Resources. Yeah, Bill Chapman, who I know is on the call too, who succeeded me as chair of the Greenway, but did it for a lot longer than I did. You know, we were all very, very young. In fact, I thought Jim was 68 and I was 34, so he was double my age. Doug thought he was 70, but at any rate, I thought, oh man, you know, at 65, I cannot be done. I mean, you know, what would Jim do? Well, Jim would take on something of this size, you know, in his late 60s or early 70s. So. And Mayor Paulie, thank you for your kind words about the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and also your engagement in the Greenway for really since close to the founding. Anyway, look forward to swapping stories and talking about whatever you guys want to on the call. And Ken's got a few questions as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Ken.
All right, let's start with one that I think is probably on everybody's mind. Everybody wants to know what it's like on the inside. What was it like to be in such an important role as the Interior Secretary in the President's cabinet with such huge responsibilities? And can you tell us what the scope of those responsibilities were and some of your perspectives and lessons learned after having served in that world for 4 years?
Yeah, well, I guess in a word, pretty overwhelming. I mean, a little bit of a fun story. I've volunteered for a long time, and it was really, you know, my volunteer work that connected me originally to this job. You know, when the University of Washington came calling about the Board of Regents, the first person I called, well, Gary Locke called me. He was governor at the time, and he reminded me, because I said, why, you know, he didn't even know that I was a graduate. And I said, why'd you pick me? And he talked about a community service thing that we did for King County about whether or not to blow up the Kingdom. And I was one of two people that said, for God's sake, don't blow up this covered structure in rainy Seattle. Go fix up Husky Stadium. So I lost and it blew up, and I watched the blow up from with my kids from Beacon Hill. But it was actually work with Jerry Grinstein on the Board of Regents and Jim Ellis. I called him and said, should I do this? You know, you've done it before. And he said, it's a lot of hard work, Sally, but yes, you should do it. So that connected me to Jerry Grinstein. Another volunteer thing I did connected me to Bill Ruckelshaus, and the two of them recommended me for the job without even asking me about it. And I actually learned that I was in the pool from a gossip column in the then Seattle PI. The job is big. It is 10 bureaus. The ones that people maybe are most familiar with would be the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and maybe the Bureau of Land Management, but it also oversees the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation, and Enforcement. It oversees the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, which is around offshore oil, gas, wind energy, development. It's of course working with tribes through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Education. It's the U.S. Geological Survey, so topographical mapping. We all appreciate our topo maps. But also the Bureau of Reclamation, so Grand Coulee Dam, Hoover Dam, a few other little dams, like over 500 of them. And then the insular areas in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and chairing the White House Council on Native American Affairs, and so it goes. Anyway, so it was a big job. And what was it like? Besides being overwhelming, I'll say, through the Senate confirmation process and into the job, like every night was like studying for a final, maybe a grad school final. So a big job, but also gave me just a deep and abiding appreciation for public servants at every level. From people like Mayor Paulie and those who serve the city of Issaquah, all the way up to the President of the United States and the people that worked in the agencies. There's 70,000 employees in Interior. And I came to appreciate just how talented they were and just how hard it was to work in government as opposed to the private sector, because your customer is everybody and everybody has different opinions. So it was pretty interesting. And the lessons I learned, there are no-brainers in government. I'm sure Mayor Paulie can relate to this. Everything is a brainer because everything has a constituency that you will hear from. So I've got lots of stories in those regards. But again, if there was one thing that trained me well for the role, it was learning from Jim Ellis and working on the Mountains to Sound Greenway, because it really is about listening to different perspectives and making sure you have a full story. And I think about, the march of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club, and both Jack Horning and Harvey Manning were citizen activists. When they left the Greenway board, it's because this is a little too collaborative for us. We want to be able to lob bombs from the outside, which they did. But that was helpful, right? That catalyzed the movement. But it was also, the Department of Natural Resources. And I think we've had every, commissioner since the Greenway was founded. And it was business people like Weyerhaeuser sitting across the table from Charlie Raines at the Sierra Club. And boy, that is what it's like to do public projects like this. And what an interesting lesson on a scale that I could wrap my head around. So when I got that job where you couldn't wrap your head around the scale, I could always go back to the local example. So pretty amazing opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Sally. And speaking of constituencies, I'm going to add a follow-up, and then we're going to go to an audience question. So get ready, Lindsay. But throughout your time in both corporate life as well as public service, and maybe particularly as Secretary of the Interior, how important was it in terms of cultivating relationships, even with adversaries who are attacking you? How do you deal with that with the tribes, with corporations, with landowners, with recreational groups? And how did you try to balance that to make everybody happy?
Again, I go back to just some lessons from our landscapes. It's very hard to have an adversary when you've actually sat across the table. You know the names of their spouse and their kids, and maybe you've been out on the landscape together, and you know each other as human beings. And I think that in a way I feel a little bit more fortunate than, with each passing year, the ability of people to kind of lob bombs on social media, hiding behind anonymity, is a problem, because to make progress, you really need to know the people. And over and over and over again, I would say the things that I felt most proud of and that I feel like we succeeded the most in were the really thorny issues, whether it was an endangered species that we were trying to protect while also supporting economic development, on public lands, or it was working with a tribal community that, really wanted to get public lands back, or at least the ability to do their traditional activities, which had been shut down because maybe it had been made a national park, or maybe a prior secretary had allowed it to be leased for oil and gas. And so how do you try and undo things like that? And it was about relationships. And all those ideologies and those labels, people thought, oh, this, woman from Seattle that worked for REI, she's got to be a liberal. So they've got, I could write the book on what they think I was, and then what I actually was, that I worked as a banker and, banked ranches and mines and oil and gas companies, always kind of through them. But when you could find common ground, when you could get past the assumptions about each other and build a relationship, magic happened. And that's really the only time magic happened, is when you got past those assumptions. And, somebody actually, the current head of the Trust for Public Land was just talking to me today and asking me a few questions about, gosh, are there some Republicans that we could be working on some bills that TPL is supporting around equity and parks and green spaces? And so I rattled off a list, and she goes, oh, wow, I had no idea. They were great people on both sides of the aisle in Congress. They're great people who were in extractive industries as well as environmental groups and so on. And it's a matter of listening and building relationships. And no better example for me to learn from than Jim Ellis, or to see happen than our collective work together on the Mountains to Sound Greenway.
Thank you, Sally. I hope everybody really listened to that answer, because there was enormous wisdom in that answer. Okay, Lindsay, gonna turn to you. I've seen some questions popping up. Do you have one you'd like to present from the audience?
Yes, and we have some wonderful questions as well from our registration page. A lot of folks offered some great questions when they registered, so I'm also going to offer some of those. This one's very relative to what we were just talking about. Sally, we would love to know, moving forward in this new administration, what do you see as the biggest challenge for Deb Haaland, our new Secretary of the Interior now?
I think that there's no lack of challenges for any Secretary of the Interior going into the job. I think as the first Native American cabinet member, which I'm delighted about, she also, that there will be sky high expectations and expectations about her connection with tribal communities, expectations about reversing some of the policies that have taken place over the last 4 years, expectations around addressing climate change. And, those are really significant. I think that I certainly am aware, and I think that people are becoming increasingly concerned, especially younger generations, about climate change and what do we do about it, and the sense of urgency, and yet the sense of hopelessness. I think one of the opportunities that she will have, and President Biden and his team will have, is shaping a picture, and this is something that, gosh, Jim and the folks at the Greenway and the Trails Club did, which is paint a vision of what can be, not a vision of the negative, but a vision of what can be. How do you support economic development while still protecting a landscape? How do you address climate change while also recognizing the challenge of job loss? How do you work with people in the fossil fuel industry who went from being pretty cooperative with me to trying to undo all the regulations that we did on things like methane emissions and so on? And how do you come back to the table and show a path forward for an industry that is very much going to be affected in the way coal mining has been affected over the last 10 years. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge. I think there's an opportunity for her, which is public lands are part of the solution. Natural climate solutions, carbon sequestration, clean water, clean air, ecosystem services that we get from the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, from our forests and our wetlands and our grasslands, and the blue environment as well, you know, eelgrass beds and so on are critically important to climate. And I think there is an opportunity that she will have to help make that case too. So no lack of things on her agenda, but she's building a good team, and I think that's going to be critical. And but it's not an easy time with a very evenly divided Senate and you know, a pretty tight environment in the House. And so that means it's all about listening and compromise. And I think that it'll be a challenge, but also an opportunity that she's pretty good at coming from the House.
Perfect. Thank you, Sally. I'm going to jump back in and then we'll go back to Lindsay. I see lots of questions popping up, and just sorry, everybody, we're not going to get to all of them, I'm sure, but we'll try to get to some. But Sally, what are your thoughts just for this audience? How can people in this audience best influence conservation, public policy, and the decisions that affect our public lands and what we all care about, or we wouldn't be on this call? What should the individual citizen do to be most effective?
Yeah, that is a great question. And it's something that I did not know the answer to myself until I sat in the chair of a public servant. And so Mayor Paulie's probably smiling about this, but you know, when you serve the public and that is your customer base, you want to hear from the public. And when you hold a public meeting and nobody shows up, or only one side shows up, they show up in droves, all with variations on the same message, you're not necessarily hearing all points of view. And I think that it is important to make sure that you convey your point of view. But I think it's also important for that public servant to make sure that other points of view are also represented. And so what can we do as citizens? We can engage. We can, frankly, I think if you only get one side presenting and it seems to dominate, that's not necessarily going to lead to a sustainable outcome, because there will be people who are angry that don't like a particular decision and don't feel like they had an opportunity to speak up. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I'd say is do your homework. I found a lot, people came to me with enough things on a piece of paper that would lead me to an obvious conclusion. But if I dug more, I would realize that they left some things out, and that they left out enough things that I was not very happy with them, because I felt like they were manipulating me. So I think, what can you do? You can make sure your facts are accurate, that you can back them up. And when you've got a clear set of facts that are that can be substantiated, then you're helping that public servant make the right decision. So those are a couple of things. I think kind of knowing who the decision makers are, like who owns the land, you know, what are the challenging issues, and then trying to see if, like, let's say it's about a trail that has to cross a piece of private property. How do you deal with that? Well, if you can pre-clear by working with that owner some of the things that need to happen in advance, you are really helping that public servant, because then two parties that could be in conflict are coming together, holding hands, saying, will you help us get this done? And so the other thing I would say is, when you're testifying or when you're speaking to an elected official, the best thing you can do is bring out a story, not a theory, but a story. You know, here's what happened when I, like Doug said, when I took my, had to be a baby child on that march back in 1990, or a very young child. You know, and here's how we have grown up in this area, and here's how this missing link or whatever would make a difference. So, and the other thing I'd say when you do engage is come with a willingness to listen and an open mind. So often, and boy, environmental groups are some of the worst at this, is, they will come knowing what they want, and all they have to do is speak louder or get more people to tell you and to get the answer that they want, but they're not listening to the other voices. And so I think that's really important too. So lots more, but anyway, I'll stop there.
Great, good advice. And just for your knowledge and for others, Christy, Doug's wife, was actually carrying baby Jacob inside her when she walked the entire distance of that march. So kudos to Christy.
Young.
Yes.
Okay.
And let me add another local maybe misconception. You talked about your facts and knowing the land you're talking about. There are so many people, maybe some on this call, who think Tiger Mountain is a state park. It's actually a state forest managed by Washington State Department of Natural Resources, not state parks. And many people get that confused. Go further, under the law, DNR manages about 2/3 of Tiger Mountain for revenue production from the timber or from antennas on top of the mountains and leasing the space for those. And the other third is a natural resource conservation area. So those are the kind of facts. You really need to understand that landscape. And I hope everybody on the call now understands Tiger Mountain better.
And I learned that from Doug Mcclelland, who took us out in a Greenway meeting and talked about sustainable and selective harvesting and sustainable forestry and how you maintain a healthy forest. So yes, that's a really good example.
Yeah, and actually Tiger Mountain is a great example of where you can mix high use recreation with timber harvesting and revenue production and wildlife habitat and environmental protection. And the DNR does an amazing job at all of those things. So I could go on and on about them, but I'll pass to Lindsay and let you ask another audience question.
Great. I have a question based on all of your great references and advice, Sally, toward relationship building and making those meaningful connections with others. It makes me think about all of these different organizations that work together. And we have a great question from the audience that is relating to our relationships to the tribes. She says, can you share some of your favorite stories about collaborating with the Native American communities in your roles?
Yes, and this is an area, thanks for that question. And this is an area where, the more I learn, the more I recognize my own ignorance. And I think back on my work as a member of the Greenway board, and we've had tribal members on the board, and we've had engagement with tribes, but it's not been at the kind of level with the kind of authenticity that I wish we had had. Some examples of collaborating with tribes, well, I mean, one really big one is in the creation of Bears Ears National Monument. So I'll tell you a story which, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but I'm going to create a juxtaposition here. Early on in my tenure, this is the kind of thing that secretaries of the Interior have to deal with. So the governor of Utah, he and I had a pretty good relationship. We negotiated on keeping national parks open by having the state pay for them during the first government shutdown I had to deal with, which was in my first year. So we're on a first name basis. So Gary Herbert was his name. And he and actually Senator Orrin Hatch, who was the senior senator for Utah at the time, said, Sally, we've got a real problem. Your Fish and Wildlife Service is trying to protect prairie dogs, and the prairie dogs are digging up our cemeteries, and we're finding the bones of our ancestors that have been dug up by prairie dogs. And I know you're, worried about the endangered black-footed ferret, but this is unacceptable. And of course, they water their cemeteries, and so they're a little more attractive, I guess, for some critters. At the same time, the tribes came to me and said, our graves are being looted, and they're being looted by local people. And those local people were residents of southern Utah, and it was a huge problem, exacerbated by the fact that many of us might go out onto these landscapes and we take our cell phones and maybe we find a sandal or a piece of pottery or a cliff dwelling, and we take a picture of it and we visit with respect and we post it on our Instagram site, and we have just given explicit instructions on a map to somebody who's not going to visit with respect and is going to steal that artifact. So current conditions suggested it was under great threat. 5 tribes came together. The Navajo, which is in part of that region, the Zuni and the Hopi. The Hopi are completely landlocked within the Navajo reservation. They don't get along very well usually, but they got together on this. The Ute, Mountain Ute, and the Ute tribes. So 5 tribes. And I went on the landscape with them, and I met with them between the Bears Ears Buttes. And one of the most meaningful and powerful meetings I had was sitting in a teepee as they talked about their connections to these landscapes and the threats and how they needed to use them, and how, you know, you've got nomadic tribes at the time, like the Navajo, that are going through, and the Ute, and you have the ancient Pueblo, descendants of the ancient Pueblo people. So Hopi and Zuni in this case, who used the land in very different ways, but all of them found it sacred. And if we had not had those meetings, and if we had not listened, we would not have understood the challenges that they faced and the just desecration of their cultures that were happening. So as I think about our region here, I know Doug respected the Coast Salish people, so if we're in Western Washington, that's true. There's also tribes of the inland Northwest, the Colvilles, the Yakima, and different bands within them. And it's complicated. And the most important thing is building a relationship, a respectful relationship, and listening. And sometimes it means listening to all of the things that my colonial ancestors did to almost eradicate these tribes. And it's important that we do listen to that. We do hear it. It's painful. It's hard to hear, but it helps provide a frame of reference. And now when I hike up Mount Si, I don't think of it the way I did before having this job. I think of it now as a sacred site, part of the creation story of certainly the Snoqualmie tribe. And I think about, you know, the expansion of parking lots and trailheads and trailhead direct bus lines and all of those things that we're proud of in the Greenway. But there's another side of that that I think we all need to be aware of. And I hope over time, some of the sort of peak bagging ethos that so many of us that are climbers or hikers might have, we'll look at it a little bit differently, and we'll begin to retreat from some areas and allow Native people to reclaim those as their own for their ceremonies and for things that are important to them. And I hope we find opportunities to learn from them, as I did in a very significant way over the time that I was in government, and as I'm continuing to do today.
Wow, that was a great question and a great answer, again, packed with wisdom. So thank you, Sally. I'm gonna shift it to one that's more personal and not dealing with the land necessarily, but you have had to try to balance, and probably continue to try to balance, a very active life with having a life. And I know for me, during the past year, during the pandemic, I've literally been out every day on a hike. And if I hadn't been, I probably would be in an asylum by now. What do you do to find that balance, to keep your personal health, mental and physical, where you want it to be? How do you sustain that?
Yeah, wow. I think we all have a keener awareness of that than we did before this pandemic. I did get lucky, and I I found a wonderful life partner who's been truly a partner. My husband Warren, now of 40, almost 43 years, 2 children and 3 grandchildren later. So that's a wonderful thing. But it is helpful to have a partner that shares the load or takes on the lion's share of the work. Sometimes in the family, there's embarrassing moments like, the school calling me to say your daughter's sick, can you come and pick her up? And I say, absolutely, I'll be right there, and then completely forgetting about it. And they call me back 2 hours later and I still haven't left. So that's pretty embarrassing. I guess the other side of that is they always call the mom, they don't call the dad. So, that may be changing over time. But, first I would say, beyond being very fortunate in terms of my relationship with Warren, is take care of the machine. To become Secretary of the Interior, to have the kind of crazy hours and demands on your time and travel schedule, it was always for me like a trade-off between work and sleep and exercise. And like family was not even in the picture a lot. And, Warren moved with me to DC, but he kind of, took care of that side of things. But like sometimes you had to work. Sometimes like you absolutely needed sleep traveling around the world or, certainly around the country. But I still tried to balance it with exercise. So short yourself to 4 hours of sleep and then hit that grubby little hotel gym at 5 o'clock in the morning before stuff starts, or, oh, I got to read this, so I'll do my reading on the treadmill or whatever device. The other thing I'd say that I've learned is understand yourself. Like, what makes you happiest? So, you're not living your life to be like Ken Koenigsmark. We all can't work for a wonderful employer like Boeing that lends us to be able to do something that we love to do for 10 years, which was amazing. Yeah. But understand yourself. So I know myself, I'm happiest when I'm on a steep learning curve, and I'm just not that fun to be around if I know what I'm doing. And so, but a lot of people, it's about mastery, and thank God it is, because they're the ones that are really masters at their work and at their job. Do you like adventure and, a little bit living on the edge, or do you like stability? And trying to align what you do with what makes you tick and what makes you happy, I think is super important. And as Ken said to begin with, nature. I mean, we are animals. We are part of nature. It's not us, man versus nature. We are nature. It is fundamental. And so I love to get out. It's very grounding. Hikes in the Greenway pretty often. There's a full moon coming up on Sunday, and instead of doing some cross-country skiing by day, I'm going to do it by moonlight with some friends, which will be kind of fun. And the other thing I'd say, and boy, I've learned this. You lose people, and there's things that you wished you'd said to them. And I would say the other thing I'd say is no regrets. Like, Jim Ellis meant the world to me, and I made sure Jim Ellis knew that by talking to him directly. I think back on my childhood mentors, a teacher, a Girl Scout leader or something, and I've actually gone back and thanked them for what they did. And so it's a little bit of, especially at this time of such great loss, saying what needs to be said to the people that you care about, or the people that shaped your journey, I think is something else that helps me sleep better at night. And then last, I'd say, for me right now, it's about mentorship. It's about thinking about what Jim Ellis did for some of us when we were babies in those early days, and how can I learn a little bit from him and give a little bit back. And I would say tribal youth right now are probably the most common mentee, at least on a formal basis, that I'm working with. That's really satisfying. So it's kind of like what makes you tick, and different things made me tick earlier in career than they do now. But take care of the machine and enjoy nature. Two to take away for this group.
Boy, another fantastic answer. I hope people are taking notes. That was good. Lindsay, let's go back to you, and let's do 2 audience questions this time.
Great. I have quite a few questions in the vein of climate change. So I'd love to sort of change our focus a little bit and talk to Sally about Let's see. One question that was great was, what are the priority actions needed right now to protect our environment and address climate change, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think priority actions right now are sort of stop the bleeding. Okay, so I think it's something like, this may have increased, but something like a football field and a half of natural habitat is being converted to man-made development every second in this country. Every second. It's really extraordinary. And so what do we have? So the Wilderness Society commissioned a study, and I think they might have used Headwaters Economics. Anyway, they outsourced it to a well-regarded economics firm. Some of you may have seen it. It goes back now probably 3-4 years, on what is the value of the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. And Headwaters Economics came up with a value of over 100 years, economic value of 100 years of $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And when you peel that back and look at what goes into it, it's not, well, if you cut all the lumber down and sell the trees. No, not at all. It's if you leave it in its natural state. Carbon sequestration, clean water, not having to put in water treatment plants or desalination plants or whatever else. It is a carbon sequestration, absorbing greenhouse gases, putting off oxygen, all of those things. So first, it's stop the bleeding. And so, one of the first things that President Biden has talked about, even did in the campaign, is we're going to stop leasing federal public land for fossil fuel development. We need to move beyond fossil fuels. And so and part of that is, in the last 4 years, a huge amount, millions of acres, has been leased, most of it not competitively. So there's an enormous amount out there. But we need to be far more discerning on where we develop. So that's one thing. There is this concept of 30 by 30. So protect 30% of the world's lands and waters by 2030. And I think that, it's a pithy phrase, and it's not just any old 30%, it's the most critical. And that may be in private hands, in tribal hands, in public hands. And, or it might be like the open seas. And so I think one of the priorities for dealing with that is not dissimilar to what I said to an earlier question. It's like, understand the land ownership, recognize the value, and there's a lot of science out there on the areas that are most critical to protect as it relates to climate change. The boreal forest, for example, in North America, wetlands, peat bogs, seagrass beds, mangroves, the blue carbon as well as the terrestrial carbon, and really work hard on making sure that those aren't damaged while putting thoughtful regulations in place that actually align economic interests with environmental interests. So what does that look like? Planting more trees, doing less development. It may be getting paid for sequestering carbon, right? It's a carbon market. The Nature Conservancy, which I'm on the board of, but I had an opportunity to run the organization through a transition year. One of the things they're doing is blue bonds, they call it. They're going to countries like the Seychelles and other typically island nations, and that have high debt, they have high debt and expensive debt, and they're basically with banks and so on guaranteeing that debt and using the differential interest, which has to then go into ocean conservation. Okay, so some really creative things on the financing side, and I think some of those kinds of creative elements will come in so that we can align the interests. So, but really it is about stop the bleeding, protect what's there, do move forward on the 30 by 30, and frankly, begin to do some work and create incentives to try and take carbon out of the atmosphere, support clean water, clean air, watersheds, ecosystem services is the buzzwordy term of the value of our natural places.
Thanks, Sally. Back to you, Lindsay, for one more from the audience.
Great, thank you, Ken. I have another great one that is going to bring it back local to us. Sally, where do you see the biggest threat to the Issaquah Alps and the Mountains to Sound Greenway area over the next 30 years? And what can we do about it?
Yeah, one of the biggest threats that I think we will face, and Commissioner Franz has certainly talked about this, is the changes on our landscape mean wildfire, Western Washington wildfire. You know, fire is not inherently bad. It's actually essential in our history. But the Issaquah Alps are full of what those of us that have worked in firefighting know is called the wildland urban interface, or WUI. Right? People, in fact, one of the pictures you showed earlier in the slideshow at the beginning had a housing development on Cougar Mountain, right, with the trees right up to the edges of those properties. And as we watch California burn, or as we watch Australia burn, this is a very significant and growing risk for Western Washington. I think Tim Egan has written about it. You know, not too long ago, there have been things coming out of the University of Washington on it, changes we see in the landscape that are going to increase the threat. So that is one thing that I think the Issaquah Alps Trails Club and the citizens of Issaquah, Snoqualmie, North Bend, and Mcclelland, and so on across the mountains are really going to need to learn about and do, and that is making their homes and the communities fire-wise. I was a red-carded firefighter during the time I was interior, not because they're going to hand a hose and a Pulaski to a 50 or 60-something-year-old woman, but because I couldn't go out on the fire lines and thank the crews without being certified myself. So that also was an incentive to stay in shape, because you had to do the pack test. So some of you've probably done that. You know, it's 15-minute miles with a 45-pound pack for 3 miles. So they time you 45 minutes for 3 miles with 45 pounds on your back. And so that was, you know, that was a good excuse to put weight on and move around. But fires are a big thing. And then I'd say, like, one of the beauties of the Greenway was working with property owners, notably Weyerhaeuser, major property owner, on how do you develop in the right ways in the right places while also maintaining the integrity of wildlife corridors or riparian setbacks. Same in Suncadia, same in the Talus development in Issaquah. I remember Talus in particular, one of our board members would proudly come and showed an example of a housing development here and a housing development here and the river running through it. And the Greenway team said, you know, it's great, but if you took this housing development and you moved it over here, you've actually got the same buffers between communities, but this allows the wildlife corridor and the whole riparian habitat on that side of the river to maintain intact, and that's one of the important streams feeding into Lake Sammamish. So it is being smart about where you develop, and it's clustering. And I know I will offend people on this call, but you know, our little 5 or 20 acres of paradise is about the worst thing you can do for wildfire and for habitat connectivity, other than putting a big fence around it and then planting a bunch of invasive species. That would make it worse. But we're growing. You know, I think Doug said earlier, or Ken, we're in one of the fastest growing areas in the country. And that means we're going to nibble away at our wildlands, and yet they're essential to habitat. So how do we do that in a smart way, a fire-wise way, a safe way, but a way that also supports the development, and so that our children and their children and generations to come and the tribal members that have been here since time immemorial will still have a place that they recognize.
Well, let's talk about that Talus development for a second, because that was a really great example. I just happen to have the final map of Talus. What I want to point out to everybody, this was about a 650-acre parcel And the original plan had development nodes scattered all over this entire parcel. But after much negotiation and a joint development agreement, including the city of Issaquah as the prime partner with the Talus development, this development got clustered on about 150 acres, interspersed with green parks in between the nodes of development, while the developer donated free of charge over 400 acres of untouched natural lands to the city. And that connects Cougar Mountain on this side, Cougar Mountain Park, over to Squawk Mountain Park on this side. It was a vital connective corridor, and the public did not pay a cent for it. And we also clustered that development on the smallest footprint possible. Those are the kind of compromises we all should be working towards.
Okay, that this was not planned. I just want everybody in the audience to know that Ken and I did not coordinate on this example. So that's pretty cool that you happen to have it. What an interesting living room you have.
You name it. I've also got Issaquah Highlands, because I suspect there's people in the Highlands on this call who also don't know that your development was clustered right here in this shaded brown section, but all of this green was donated by the developer in order to get higher density zoning where the houses are. That was called the 4-to-1 program, where the developer donated 4 acres of open space, untouched land, which is now Grand Ridge Park. For every 1 acre, they got high density zoning on. So we preserved 80% of the land in doing so. Those are the kind of trade-offs that have helped make the Issaquah Alps and the Greenway. And I hope at a national level, we're doing that too.
Yes, and you know what? Clustered housing means easier to serve with public transit, sewage systems, maybe gray water systems as they have in the Sequami Ridge development. And they're much more fire-wise. You can protect a cluster of houses. And how many of those horrifying situations have we seen in Paradise, California, and so on? You don't want to be there. So that's another good reason. Yeah.
Okay, Lindsay, we've got time for about one more question, I think. So if you've got one, let's present that to Sally.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ken. Great. Well, I have a really awesome question here from one of our registrants. And this is about advocacy. As we're talking about the future, I feel like this question is very relative. What does the future of advocacy look like? How can young people make direct impacts today?
Well, I'd say it's a great question. And I should probably turn it back to a younger person that might be asking. I would say that as a boomer, to quote Ken earlier, the tools that are available today are so much more powerful. The ability to use technology to tell a story. We've been transported all over the world by sitting in the same chair this year, right? At least I have. I have met people around the world. I've learned stories from around the world. I've been pulled into discussions around the world because of the use of technology and storytelling. And so much of that is driven by people that are younger than my own children, which I think is a wonderful thing. So I think advocacy will involve social media, no question about it, and its evolution. You've seen the power of social media for good and for evil. The vulnerabilities that I think will get worked out over time. It's some of these platforms are new and people figure out the dark side. Whether that's international hacking networks or organized criminals, or those who want to undermine our democracy. But the future looks like getting a lot more voices to a table to be heard than we've ever had before. And if you think about those examples that I used of listening, yes, I think being across the table from someone, getting to know them personally is important. But there's a phrase that is as true today as it was, many years ago. And that's, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so what does that mean? It means if you've got a point of view, it's really important that you find a way to convey it, because somebody probably has a point of view that's the polar opposite of yours. And I think that advocacy in today means that you have a better chance of finding your voice to that table, because in the past that table might have been limited to those within the network, that club, that it was very hard to break into. And I think it's very different today, and you can make an awful lot of noise to make those club members really uncomfortable if they're not paying attention. So I think advocacy is evolving, and that's a really good thing. But advocacy of Harvey Manning and Jack Horning and Doug Mcclelland and those who walked from the mountains to the sound was pretty darn effective, and I think we'll see that too.
Thanks, Sally. You know what I'd add to that too? If you're going to be an effective advocate, you better have the passion, the fire in the belly. Or, as my boss in Boeing, when I was loaned to the Greenway, said, you better have a missionary zeal to do the work to be effective, because it takes a lot of your life, a lot of your time, a lot of your energy, and it leads to conflict, inevitably, with, as Sally said, those who have a polar opposite view. So it inserts you into conflict, which a lot of us would rather avoid. I kind of thrive on that, so it's no problem. But just expect that if you want to be an effective advocate, it's going to take work, it's going to take dedication, it's going to take fire in your belly, but you can make a huge difference to the world. And I think we've heard that from Sally tonight, and I really want to thank you, Sally. I think everybody sees why I respect you and value your wisdom so much after listening to your answers. And thank you so much for sharing all of that with us tonight.
Well, thank you guys all for the work you do and the enjoyment you take in the landscapes that I love so dear. And I am going to take a quick look at the chat and see how many I missed, because it kept popping up. I couldn't pay attention to any of it. But it's been a pleasure, and please keep advocating for these special places. The Issaquah Alps are vulnerable to development. They're right on the edge, and yet they are so important. And your advocacy means that you have the kind of accessible green space, nature, habitat right in your backyards that I know you value, and generations to come will value too. So keep up the great work, and keep getting out on the trail. I look forward to seeing you out there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. Well, now let's shift to someone that's not a boomer, someone in a younger generation who has stepped up and taken the leadership of the Issaquah Alps Trails Club as our president, David Dunphy. And he has brought some of that younger technological savvy, younger energy, just younger awareness than I and others may have had when we were involved at his age. And he's been our president for, I believe, going on 2 years now. And so let me turn it over to David. And again, thank you, Sally. Thank you, Lindsay. Off to you, David.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much to Doug and Mary Lou for starting us off, and that amazing conversation, Ken and Sally. Yeah, just it's inspiring to hear the work that's been done, and we just so appreciate your mentorship as we take up the work still to be done. The Trails Club right now has 6 key priorities after we finished up our strategic planning. That's critical land acquisition, healthy habitats, trail connectivity, climate resiliency, community engagement, and partnership. And the core of moving that work forward is our volunteer advocates pushing on all these issues that arise across our landscape. And one example of that right now is what's happening at Coal Creek. There's a development and there's been a group really working hard called Save Coal Creek that the Trails Club has been supporting and part of. We have a really great video that was put together thanks to Ryan Thrower, and we'd love to share with you that video so you can learn a little bit about one of the many advocacy projects that are happening now.
Thanks again to Ryan Thrower for his awesome videography skills and his generous support of the Issaquah Alps. Opportunities to save parcels like the one next to Coal Creek are unpredictable, and available resources like funding are critical to securing these properties as public lands. This is why we have created the Issaquah Alps Opportunity Fund. This fund empowers generous donors to advocate for the Issaquah Alps landscape and its habitat by providing resources to fund public land acquisitions, support land management, and engage the community in order to fulfill our mission to preserve, protect, and promote the Issaquah Alps for present and future generations. We're also partnering with the Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust and the Trust for Public Land to create a fund specifically for land conservation named in honor of Jim Ellis, who undertook a life of community service and taught us how to preserve and protect nature in an era of booming urban growth. In a time of rising real estate prices, key parcels like the one near Coal Creek are in high demand and frequently sell well above value, outpricing public agencies who are limited in what they can pay to acquire them. Literally in the last few days, an amazing opportunity has come up to purchase a gorgeous property filled with old growth trees that we've had our eye on for decades in the Issaquah Alps. And in order to save highly valued forest land like this, we need the support of private funds and donors like you to secure special wild places like this. So a generous public lands advocate has offered a matching challenge tonight to help launch our new Issaquah Alps Opportunity Fund. The first $10,000 in donations will be matched, establishing a $20,000 fund to urgently support public lands and trails within the Issaquah Alps, which is why I am asking you, our community, to please consider making a generous donation by visiting our website at issaquahalps.org. You can also find the link to our website in the chat to the right of your screen. Your donations will be doubled tonight. So again, I ask you, please consider making a generous gift to the Issaquah Alps Trails Club. Your support will make opportunities to preserve and protect public lands possible. Thank you all for attending our forum and for considering making a generous donation. And I look forward to seeing you on the trails. I'll pass it back to David now.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay, for introducing the Opportunity Fund. That will be a really key tool moving forward. And we hope that people consider that tonight. Yeah, I just want to take one last time to thank all of our partners that helped make this event possible, the Greenway, the City of Issaquah, the amazing City of Issaquah staff, Carissa, our UW grad student that put a bunch of this together, and of course, Sally and Ken for a great conversation. And you all for the gift of your time. All this stuff, it's clear that it happens because passionate people come together to give back to our public spaces. And from the very beginning, that was about boots on the ground, connecting people to the landscape, and then taking on the challenges. And we definitely have a lot of challenges. You know, we talked about climate change. We know that the last pieces of parcels are going to be some of the most expensive. We need to ensure that our public lands are welcoming to all people. And we have to make sure that we have the funds to pay for the infrastructure and education to keep them vibrant for years and years to come. So as we close down tonight, I encourage everybody to think about what is the ways that they're going to get involved in their public lands. Maybe that's donating to the Opportunity Fund. Maybe that's enrolling into the Alpiner, our newsletter, to learn about our landscape here in the Alps and how they can give back. Or maybe it's thinking about volunteering, joining the board, joining the advocacy group, finding other ways to get involved. But whatever it is, appreciate it, and we'll see you on the trail soon. Have a good night.
Hey, City of Issaquah staff, I don't know if you can hear me, but thank you for all your fine work in putting this on.
It was a pleasure. Great job, Ken.
Everybody did a great job. I was just a piece of it, but it all worked out, I think, really well. And Sally's wisdom was inspiring. Very, really a great show, I think.
It sure was.
Anyway, thank you. I'll sign off.
Can we chat?
Oh, yeah, I'll stay on, sure.
Nice job, Ken.
Nice job, everybody.